Any questions about Mill or Kant so far? The next essay is a ways away yet. We have to look at a third philosopher who's going to take a bit longer, and then we're going to have our case study, which is going to involve watching a film in class. Yay, movies. All right. And as I have been framing the discussion, welcome folks. As I have been framing the discussion, so far what we've been doing is looking at two different ethical theories that come in the form of systems that are characterized by theoretical machinery that is modular and thus subject to modification in order to render the theory more resilient against counterexamples. How well those theories did against the counterexamples is up to you to decide in your paper. That's what you'll be arguing one way or another. And so, on the one hand, you have Kant arguing that we need to start with reason. You have Mill, on the other hand, saying we have to focus on results. And if you should find yourself throwing up your hands and saying, why am I choosing between results and reason? Maybe we're failing, maybe these systems, right, we hinted at this when we were talking about Kant and how human minds are not necessarily like computers in that computers operate by lines of code. That human cognition, that is characterized by the use of heuristics. We take shortcuts, we cheat, we don't do everything by rules. We make certain leaps we can't necessarily account for because what we're trying to do is complete the pattern, right? We are pattern recognizers, and that's how we avoid the things that threaten us and pursue the things that nourish us. Right? So we've already hinted at this, that maybe systems are not good for human beings. They're good for some kind of other being. Right? And maybe by following systems, we risk turning ourselves into robots. Does anybody know the etymology of the word robot? It's a Czech word that means slave. And so the next philosopher we're going to look at is very attuned to this problem, right? If we're promoting ethical systems that train people to be dependent and obedient to them, are we sacrificing part of our humanity? So that's why in the book, Nietzsche is mislabeled as the anti-philosopher. It's more accurate to say that he is very much a philosopher, but what he is anti is anti-systematicity. This is why he's a little bit of a slippery character to grasp. He's not trying to present a step-by-step formula for how to be good. He's trying to say something deeper about human nature and pointing out that we have been and are continuing to leave part of ourselves behind. We'll get into that later. But the part that we've left behind, just to gesture in that direction, he calls the Dionysian. We'll call it the Dionysian impulse. And he's going to contrast it with the Apollonian impulse. Dionysian and Apollonian. These can be thought of as different aspects of the human spirit, different impulses within human beings in their psyche. Okay? The Apollonian impulse is the rule-making, rule-following, part of ourselves, ratiocination, the constructive part of humanity, okay? The Dionysian element is the party soul, the get on down soul, the funk, right? And he says that we have gone too far in the direction of following the Apollonian in order to create a safer, more predictable world. And in doing so, we have sacrificed something important about ourselves, our Dionysian aspect. So as I say, as an anti-systematist, Nietzsche's going to be a little tough to nail down because he's literally trying to not sort of be caught and summarized, right? He is unabashedly elitist. He even says, when I talk about France or England, I'm talking about 4 or 5 people at most.
Are the names derived from the gods?
Yes, they are. Yeah, Dionysus was the party god. If you guys know the band The Doors, Jim Morrison was really into Dionysus, and it got him in trouble with the law. He would get naked in front of 10,000 people on stage while playing music, right? Tell them all they were slaves. Kind of an obnoxious character. But it's a good movie. Val Kilmer plays it. Anyway. Yeah, and if you're devoted to the truth of Christianity, you might want to not look into the Dionysian, right? Born under a star sign, people making a pilgrimage to come see him, virgin birth, all that is from Dionysus, which is a story that's much earlier, right? But so we're going to start out by saying, by noting that Nietzsche says, we've been doing the wrong thing with philosophy since basically Socrates. And that the last 2,500 years has been one big mistake. People don't like hearing that. But he says that the mistake we made is we narrowed down philosophy too much as a human enterprise and tried to make it about the search for truth. But Nietzsche says that philosophy is not about the search for truth. It is instead about finding what improves life. Truth may or may not serve what improves life. Sometimes we're better off not knowing, right? There's something deeper that's going on in human beings. So psychologically, okay, Nietzsche, like the other philosophers we studied, was a bit of a prodigy, recognized at an early age, promoted to the rank of philosopher at a young 35 years of age, which is young for then. Now we crank them out in their 20s, for God's sake. But anyway. But he had quite a disruptive childhood, and this sort of left a mark on him throughout life. When Nietzsche was 4, his father died from a brain ailment, and died in severe and very vocal agony. Nietzsche had to witness that, and then 6 months later, his younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, died. So he's surrounded by all this tragedy, right? And the sort of emotional bottom on his world has dropped out. The degree of his PTSD can be noted in the fact that he used to send his underwear home to his mom through the mail to wash, yeah. Which is funny because he's, he presents himself as this voice on the mountainside roaring out, do not be disobedient. He's sending his, shorts back to his mom. Anyway, you probably don't need to know that for this class, but I found it out and thought it was hilarious. So, for Nietzsche, what he says on the surface is going to seem really wackadoo to us at first, okay? That's been the case a couple times now anyway. But in order to explain where Nietzsche is coming from, we have to dive back into metaphysics for a bit. Okay. So, I need to go back a few philosophers, okay? So, Nietzsche follows the philosopher Arthur Nietzsche, German philosopher, I forgot to say this, German philosopher, late 19th century. He died in the year 1900. He spent the last 10 years of his life in a coma after having a mental breakdown in Turin, Italy, where he was watching a man whip a horse. And he couldn't stand it anymore, and he had so much empathy, he threw himself across the horse to take the whip himself. Dramatic brother. Arthur Schopenhauer was a philosopher who greatly influenced Nietzsche. Okay? I'll talk about how he got to Schopenhauer for just a minute. Nietzsche's father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all Lutheran ministers, men of God. And he himself had every intention of growing up to be a Lutheran minister himself. Now, you may or may not know this, but the Lutheran Church is an oxymoron. I grew up Lutheran part of the time, Catholic part of the time, depending on which school was better. So it was like, what's the real... I don't know why people fought a 30-year war on the continent of Europe over this, right? But anyway, or, Northern Ireland, how about that, right? They're at war with each other because of this difference between... But Lutheranism, Martin Luther's 95 Theses, right, add up to saying that, in essence, this is Martin Luther, that in the relationship between an individual and their God, there is no need for a middleman, namely the church. And we're going to find that paradoxically Nietzsche has a great deal of respect for Jesus Christ, but despises the church. So, in essence, we're going to find that Nietzsche is sort of the most Lutheran there ever was. But he's not just going to deny God, he's going to deny... he's not going to deny the church, he's going to deny God as well. Okay. But after leaving seminary, right, he was in seminary to study to be a minister. But he got lost in the library or something and started reading philosophy books. Or he was led to them by one of his friends, is probably more likely, or one of his mentors. There we go. And so he went to university to study as a philologist. Philology is simply the history of philosophy. And so what we're going to find from Nietzsche is he's going to make these very sweeping conclusions that cover thousands of years of history. Because most philosophers training as philosophers to be professors of that pretty much are responding to the most popular philosophers of their day, and they're in the conversation that way. So they're influenced by and influencing their contemporaries more than anything else. And of course, Aristotle, right, going back. But Nietzsche, as a historian of philosophy, took a very long view and saw things that a regular philosopher wouldn't see. Okay? So, in believing that the last 2,500 years have been a mistake, that's one way to see him, right? That's why he's bellowing so greatly. That's why he uses such bombastic language, does use bombastic language. As he's standing athwart history 2,500 years worth and saying, we're going in the wrong direction. Turn around. You're becoming too Apollonian, right? Right? In essence, he says the mistake goes back to Plato saying that reality is in another place. That this world is not important, that the real world is elsewhere. And of course, Christians subsequently took Plato's idea and turned that somewhere else into heaven and hell. Okay? but this idea that reality is somewhere else.
Sorry.
No worries, I kind of like it. It kind of adds to it, yo.
It does that every time it restarts.
Kind of adds to it, yo. No, I feel you. I'm very familiar with that sound. I lived for 11 years in San Francisco. San Francisco was basically that sound. Right. This idea that reality is in another place, taken on by the church, the Christian church, had created an ethics based upon putting all our hopes in a next life. Meanwhile, neglecting this one, which Nietzsche said makes individuals sick. We're neglecting ourselves that we know we have in favor of something we imagine is going to happen later. Right? So it makes humans sick, requiring, as it does, neglect of this life, and requiring an Apollonian, right, rigid, self-denying, rule-making, rule-following approach to life. Okay. So his way of accounting for human life and for philosophy is going to be non-linear. So it's difficult. Everything that I've taught you guys so far has been linear. Plato starts with the cave. It's a story about going in and going back. Linear one way and then the other. And we can translate that into an ontological hierarchy, right? Aristotle is more complicated but generates things in a linear fashion as well. Mill and Kant are more linear still. They have us actually follow directions, a particular protocol when we're thinking about ethics, right? So in explaining Nietzsche, I'm not uncomfortable doing it, but I am going to kind of have to shift gears, and you'll see me sort of trying to resist linearity. And so for Nietzsche, it's not so much going through step by step from beginning to end as taking several passes over this odd new territory we're going to be exploring. Okay. So, metaphysics, right? Arthur Schopenhauer was the philosopher who changed Nietzsche's life the most. But there's a story we have to tell leading up to Schopenhauer. And it starts basically with a Scottish 18th century philosopher, David Hume. David Hume. Who is an empiricist. The empirical philosophers. Hume basically followed John Locke, another English philosopher, in saying that all legitimate mental content is traceable back to some sense experience. A simple Humean idea is something like forms almost, the blueness of this bottle, the cylindricality of this bottle. These are simple ideas, and out of simple ideas we generate complex ideas. But any complex idea you can't trace back to a simple idea that we can cue to sense experience is thereby illegitimate. The empiricists say this because we've spent a lot of our history imagining all kinds of stuff that isn't there, right? Griffins and unicorns and stuff, dragons, right? Human imagination is pretty wild. So if we're going to try to get at the reality behind things, we need to trace it back to sense experience. I've talked about empirical picture a few times in here now. Empirical just means referring to the information we get via our five senses. Okay, so here's what David Hume argued, right? If the only legitimate ideas are ones we can trace back to sense data, then for instance, when we see one billiard ball strike another billiard ball which then moves, what are we actually seeing there? How many events are there here? Right? There's this event, We'll call that 1. And then there's this event, which we'll call 2. We are then tempted to say, human beings, right, and this is a heuristic we have, that ball A's striking ball B caused ball B to move. But we don't actually observe that. What we observe is, and you can do it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, stay up all night, all we see is one event followed by a second event. There's no third thing in here that we can call a cause. It isn't something in our sense experience. What we can talk about, Hume says, is constant conjunction. Boy, oh boy. Constant conjunction. We see this event followed by this event. Do it 10,000 times. You'll always see one event followed by the second event. But there's no third thing in there that we can call a cause. It's just that these two events are conjoined in a way that is constant. So that's a pretty huge challenge. If we can't account for causality, if we can't give a causal account of events as they happen, essentially the entire project of science is doomed. Science is about explaining causes, right? That's controversial, but right, if we can't, this is the way it was taken by the philosophers of their time, right? Whether or not science actually needs cause is something that is debatable in philosophy of science these days, but I'm not going to get into those far wrinkles. What's pertinent for the story we're telling about getting up to Schopenhauer and then Nietzsche is that Immanuel Kant read what Hume had to say about causality, and it caused him a real crisis. He had a real crisis of faith in what he was devoting his life to, explaining the world around us, right? And without cause, he felt he could no longer do that. And so in the face of Hume's criticism, Kant argued that we have an image of things in our heads. Now, we all right now sitting in this classroom have a 5-sensory movie going on. It's something it's like to be sitting where you are, facing the way you are, doing what you're doing. Right? And so the fact that there's a movie in here going on is not controversial. The whole game is, where the hell does it come from? Okay? So, I don't think I need that. Yeah, I do. What Kant said is that even though the movie in our head is merely a representation of things in themselves, the fact that our mind is a reducing valve and that we only see in a particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum, right, the visible light spectrum, because we admittedly do not experience things exactly as they are, but rather through interpretation, our minds can never really get at, we can't get around our senses and experience things outside of them. Our 5 senses are the only way we can experience the world around us, right? And yet there is a movie there. Something's got to be causing that, right? And so he said, okay, I'm not going to say anything about objects in the world, mind-independent objects, right? Mind-independent objects as they are in themselves. I'm not going to describe them. You can't say what the color they are, what size they are, but they are out there and they're called noumena. Here's what's going on in here is phenomena. Phenomena is just, right? Sesame Street song? No. The 5-sensory movie we're talking about, right? And so the world is divided for Kant, into phenomena and noumena, our experience of things and things as they actually are. And the one thing he says about noumena, can't tell us what shape, size, color they are, but what he says is, there's one thing we do know about noumena, things in themselves, right? This is what this means, things in themselves, right? He says the one thing we do know about them is that they're causal. Oops. How does that go off the rails? What fallacy is that? He's trying to account for cause. And he says, okay, we can't see that in the world. But whatever is in the world, mind-independent objects I'm going to call noumena, as opposed to the way that they seem to my senses, right? Whatever else you can say about them, it's not much. But one thing you can say is that they're causal. It's begging the question, right? It's smuggling in your intended conclusion as one of the premises. Oh, you want me to explain cause? Well, homina, phenomenal world, noumenal world, right? And by the way, the only thing we know about noumena is, hey, they cause stuff, right? That's question begging. He's supposed to be accounting for causality, not just pulling it up like a rabbit out of a hat. Do you see how he fails? So Kant fails to adequately address Hume's point about causality. Kant, I don't think, was aware of that, but Schopenhauer was. Schopenhauer saw that this is question begging. And so there's still a phenomenal realm here and a noumenal realm here, right? What's in our heads? What's outside our heads, okay? And so he keeps these two realms, but Schopenhauer, this is, drops all mention of noumena, and instead says that the world is divided between phenomena and will. Remember I said will is going to get really strange? This is where it starts. Okay? That there is some kind of force operating out there in the mind-independent world, but we can't call it causal, right? Because that's begging the question. But we experience change, because one of the most basic questions in philosophy is, right, what accounts for change? Why was this thing alive yesterday and dead today, right? And so there is a process, not a process, a phantasmagoria, right? The movie doesn't just stay static, it keeps moving. Things keep happening within it in the phenomenal realm, right? And so Schopenhauer's book is called The World as Will and Representation. And that's all there is to the world. There's the representation, what we have in our heads, and then all we can say about the mind-independent world is that it is will. So what is this now? It's not just, we defined will earlier as the capacity of mind that takes ideas and turns them into action, right? It's the get or done capacity of the human mind. So that will is present in us, but both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche following him say that will is also an aspect of the universe, and that each of our individual wills is a part of this greater will. You're going to think, oh, so he's treating will as God. No, definitely not. Schopenhauer was extremely depressed by this idea, right? That we are basically riding and experiencing phenomena on this ungovernable maelstrom we call the cosmos. And Schopenhauer said, right, that because that is the nature of humanity and we can't do anything about it, we should withdraw from life, like the Buddhists say, and detach. He had a lot of affinity for Buddhism, okay? Because, in fact, the Western tradition had sort of hit a brick wall Hume, right? On the question of causality. So from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche, the final step, Nietzsche saw Schopenhauer's despair and said, screw that guy. Yes, everything he said is true, but we're going to say yes to that. We're going to say yes to this situation that we're in, right? And the other main thing he does is he gets rid of the two realms. Everything is just will. Okay? And so, more deeply than distinguishing good from evil, for Nietzsche it's going to be whatever serves. I'm going to take Arthur Schopenhauer out of here now. Will to power. Will to power is a phrase we're going to be looking at over and over in here. Not over and over. I made that sound redundant. But we're going to look at it from a few different angles because what he's saying is that will to power is humanity's motivational monism. A motivational modism. So we can ask ourselves, right, regarding motivation. Why are we sitting in this terribly lit classroom right now with not very comfortable chairs listening to this wackadoo, right, go on and on, right? Well, because I want to do well in this class. Why? Because I want to get a degree. Why? Because it'll give me a better job. Why? And all of those things trace back, right, to basic reasons. I want to have a happy life, right? But all of these chain of reasons that we can give to other reasons all end up, Nietzsche says, as will to power. That's a motivational monism. Everything we do traces back to our inner effort to expand and consolidate our power. Power to do what? Not brute force. It's going to turn out that will to power is the will to resist obedience to systematicity. So again, it's less linear and going to be more like, we have to go into more of a spider diagram model for Nietzsche. Okay, we can do it, but you're going to notice that being different from the way we presented the other philosophers. Okay, so he believes that human beings are essentially, right, trying to create power, and that obedience to systems, utilitarianism, deontology, Christianity, are all bad for us. And thwarts our will to power. Okay? So one thing he does also take from Schopenhauer is that since everything is will, right, not intellect, but will, right, that the cosmos does not have a rational basis. And we, as children of the cosmos, likewise have irrationality at our core. Okay. And so this is why we're seeking something more basic than truth. So if will is indeed the single force behind all phenomena, right, we are irrational within but have a rational surface. Okay? And this irrational aspect of ourselves is what he calls the Dionysian impulse. Okay. So we need to, in order to explain how to navigate this world in which all is will, right? Nietzsche goes back before Socrates and Plato, to an individual, an ancient Greek philosopher, whose name was Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the guy who said, you can't step in the same river twice. Why can't you step in the same river twice?
By the time you get to it, the erosion has changed it to a different river.
So the very nature of a river is that it changes. Hence it can't be the same, right? Its nature is that it is a flowing thing. And so metaphysically speaking, Heraclitus says all is flux. That the only constant in this universe is change. Okay. And so that's going to show up in Nietzsche when he critiques systems of any kind. That if all is flux, the last thing you want to do is be stuck inside some rigid system. If you do, and you're in this, right, if the universe is just this maelstrom of change, then if you're going to be too rigid in your approach to life, it's that situation where it's bend like the willow tree, break like the oak. And the more rigid your system, the more likely it is to be oak and thus break. Okay. So, here's a second pass over the territory. Okay. Nietzsche says that the framework of good versus evil is the wrong one. And that instead we want to look at the Dionysian Apollonian dichotomy. That the Apollonian and Dionysian better capture humans in their true nature, right? And he's not trying to say, hey, we've become too Apollonian, we have to retrieve, we have to rejuvenate our Dionysian self within us. He's not saying get rid of the Apollonian. He's just saying we have to rebalance these and bring this back somehow. So the Apollonian does have its place, but it's eclipsing the Dionysian to such a great degree that, in essence, we've over-domesticated ourselves. Okay. In exchange for a more peaceful, predictable world. Do we know what a Faustian bargain is? Faust made a deal with the devil to gain the world. So he had control over the world, but it cost him his soul. Nietzsche is saying that our emphasis, and increasing emphasis on the Apollonian, is in effect a Faustian bargain. We're giving up our Dionysian soul in exchange for a safer, more predictable world. Okay. And he's going to end up making not a logical justification. This is going to sound really weird. Instead of logic, he justifies his way of looking at things through music. Okay, so we'll try to account for that as time goes by. So just quickly, let's put a little more detail into these concepts, Apollo and Dionysus. Okay, so yes, they are based on the Greek gods. Apollo represents harmony, progress, clarity, logic, and the principle of individuation. That I'm up here and I'm separate and you're over there and we're not the same thing. The Dionysian is the opposite. The Dionysian brings us all together. Dionysian festivals in ancient Greece, don't blame this on me, I wasn't there, but Dionysian festivals would involve animal sacrifice and a large feast, followed by consumption of psychedelic mushrooms and a gigantic orgy, where everybody gives up their individuation and comes back right, into the one, right? People still do that. You can find it somewhere. Ibiza, maybe? Probably Ibiza is probably where, you wanna know where Ibiza is? It's in the Atlantic, it's a little island. It's known for house music. Techniques, 1200s, baby. Yeah, that's right. Dionysus, by contrast, represents disorder, intoxication, emotion, ecstasy, and unity, right? Unity as opposed to the principle of individuation. And so Freud, Sigmund Freud, did call Nietzsche the first psychologist, because Nietzsche is trying to kind of get inside human beings individually and not sort of give structures from outside to impose upon ourselves, but he's exploring us from within and going from within outward, okay? And so these two human impulses, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, exist in what's called dialectic with one another. Dialectic. Not Dianetics, right? There's a Scientology building on South Temple right around the corner from me. I just laugh every time I go by. But, remember Tom Cruise? Yeah. Right? What is a dialectic? A dialectic is a relationship of opposing forces. They operate in opposition to one another, but that doesn't mean that they don't need each other. Right? Sort of each of us has two sides, Apollonian and Dionysian. Right? So, what Nietzsche is hearkening back to, right? He says that we need to be less obedient and live more like the Greek tragedians when they would put on plays, right? The Apollonian and Dionysian, he identified from Greek plays, right? From Greek tragedy. That the Apollonian and Dionysian juxtaposition appears in the interplay of the forces in a Greek tragedy. There's the hero of the drama, right? The main protagonist, who struggles to make, in an Apollonian sense, order of his unjust and chaotic Dionysian fate. Okay. So again, power is not brute force, but the casting off of systematicity for a musical model. Right? If all is flux, as Nietzsche agrees with Heraclitus saying, right? If all is flux, then rigid systems like logic will not avail us, right? Then like the willow break like the oak, right? And if you think about this, you can, I don't know if there are any jazz fans in here. I'm a freak for jazz. And my favorite musician is Charlie Parker, aka Bird. Musicians like him and John Coltrane and Billie Holiday could do this thing that's called, what the hell is it called? Improvisation. Where they don't need to sheet music in front of them. They don't need to follow the notes, the external directions on it. They find it within them. Right? And so instead of being an expert in particular maps, they have the navigational skill to cover any kind of territory. Okay? And they can improvise instead of following. Nietzsche is saying that's how we ought to live. Good luck doing that in traffic, right? But anyway, so that's kind of a first glimpse into this very different world we're going to be exploring, Friedrich Nietzsche. So we'll continue there Friday and talk more about this and start situating the three of these philosophers, Mill, Kant, and Nietzsche, in relation to one another so that you can be comfortable writing about them. Any questions before we adjourn? Okay, y'all, thanks so much for showing up today. Good to see you all. Enjoy the beautiful weather, and we'll see you Friday.
See you on Friday.
All right, brother. Have a good one. Get that? Let me them pills. Get that? Go and get them pills. Mm-mm.